Thanks for joining us today, Professor Cavanaugh. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Doing really well. Thanks again so much. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, I'm not a very interesting person, but I was born and raised Catholic, went to Notre Dame as an undergrad, was going to be a chemical engineering major and got hooked on theology. Taught high school in Colorado for a year, got a master's at Cambridge, went to Chile for a couple of years and worked in a poor area of Santiago under the military regime with the church down there, and then got a PhD at Duke. And my dissertation, which became my first book, is about the church's resistance to human rights abuses under the military regime. And so I do a lot on the intersection of theology and politics and economics. I taught at the University of St. Thomas for 15 years and then moved here to Chicago to DePaul University, where I am also the director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology, a very pretentious name for a few of us in a filing cabinet. And we are a research center for the Catholic Church in the global south, so Africa, Asia, and Latin America.
A Cambridge man, yes, a fellow Cambridge man. Seth went to Oxford, so
Oh,
we try to shame
boo.
him for that whenever we can. Well, awesome. Thank you for that introduction. And with that background, let's jump right into your thought. What is religion? How is it defined, and how does its definition play into this notion of religious violence?
Yeah, that's kind of the whole problem that I'm trying to unpack in that book. So, the myth of religious violence is not a defense of religion as if we knew what we were talking about when we said religion, right? And so, what I call the myth of religious violence is not just the idea that, you know, Christians can use violence on behalf of Christianity and Muslims can use their, Muslim faith to produce violence. I think that's true and obvious. But the myth of religious violence is the idea that religion causes more violence, has more of a tendency towards violence than secular things, whatever those are. And so it depends on this entirely on this distinction between the religious and the secular. And so in the book, what I do is show how flexible this distinction is and how historically contingent this distinction is. There is no religious secular distinction as we know it until the modern era. In the medieval era, the religious secular distinction was a distinction between two different kinds of priests, those that belonged to an order and those that belonged to a diocese. And so the idea that there is something called religion, which is separate from secular things, is a new idea, and it's a very flexible one at that. So Christopher Hitchens, his book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything is the subtitle. Typical British understatement, right? He says that, religion causes all this kind of trouble. And then he eventually comes to the fact that regimes like Stalin's regime and Marxist regimes are terribly violent, and so instead of owning them as fellow atheists, he just says, well, they're religious too, right? Totalitarianism is a religious impulse because it's about the perfection of the human person. So everything he doesn't like gets put in this category of religion. Anything violent gets put in the category of religion. And then he says things like, in no real as opposed to merely nominal sense was Martin Luther King a Christian because he was nonviolent. And we all know that Christianity is violent, and so so anything violent gets called religion and everything nonviolent is not. So and this is kind of typical of the way the discourse runs. And so there's a lot of scholars that think that nationalism is a religion, but when it comes to this argument that religion causes violence, then the people that want to make that argument will say, no, nationalism is not a religion. It's a a secular thing. And so, yeah, so that's part of what I'm trying to do in the book is question this whole distinction between the religious and the secular.
So, go ahead, Seth.
Yeah, I was just gonna follow up on that and just say, yeah, jumping right into that, Hitchens' idea, it does seem a little bit extreme, but you still hear, even among common people, that religions divide people up and they cause wars. I mean, look at what it's doing in the Middle East right now. And my question to you is, if it's a modern idea that religions are sort of separate from the secular, where did this idea start that religions are this divisive thing separate from sort of the common secular culture?
Yeah, I mean, the whole distinction between the religious and the secular really arises in the early modern period in Europe, and it's a way of marginalizing the church. So basically, the church and the secular, the civil authorities have been vying for power for many years, and in the early modern period, the civil authorities win more or less, and so what the church is left with is this thing called religion, which is essentially private and needs to be kept out of the public sphere. This is a huge oversimplification of a very complex process, but that's basically the idea. And so by labeling religion as something inherently divisive and violent, then this is a way of marginalizing certain kinds of beliefs and practices and authorizing others. And so the church then can be shunted off to the side and the civil authorities kind of take over. So you find it in early modern figures like Spinoza and Hobbes and Locke and so on, who are busy about this kind of, buttressing state authority. And this is one of the ways that they do it.
So you've just provided a super nuanced explanation where people want to just blame religion for everything, but actually you can't even single out religion as a separate part of society that gets blamed for things until quite recently.
Right.
And things were so integrated and overlapping that it's hard to say religion did this and not these other things. And these types of modern distinctions don't really work when you look back at history.
Yeah,
And
that's
yet,
right.
go ahead.
So
Good.
yeah, were the Aztecs' bloody human sacrifices, was that caused by religion or by politics? Right? I mean, it's a nonsensical question. They just didn't make those kind of distinctions, right? The Romans, Caesar was a god, and so how do you separate religion from politics under those circumstances? So it's a kind of nonsensical question uh, in any society that's not a kind of modern Western or been Westernized.
So, I mean, that's a super nuanced position. And I think it diffuses a lot of these questions. And yet, I still have to imagine that you're constantly getting people coming up to you going, what about the Crusades? What? I mean, come on. There's religious motives there. I mean, even if that category of religion doesn't quite work, they're going to fight the Muslims to get back the Holy Land. Come on. How might you respond to something like that?
Sure. I mean, I'm not at all arguing that Christianity hasn't and doesn't still produce violence. It does. I mean, clearly it does. Same thing with Islam and other kind of faith systems, right? But the myth of religious violence is the idea that because it's religious, whatever that is, it's more prone to violence than secular things. Right. So religion is divisive, it's irrational, and so on, and it's absolutist. And that's why it produces more violence. So, the Crusades were bad. There's no kind of whitewashing that. But if you look at, if you compare the period of the Crusades with the 20th century and how much blood was spilled in the 20th century over things that are usually considered secular, right? I mean, the casualties in World War One, which is basically about nationalism, dwarf the casualties of all the 19 centuries that precede it combined, right? The Inquisition is another thing that gets raised, right? This in the Spanish Inquisition, which lasted 350 years. Scholars estimate that between 3,000 and 5,000 people were put to death. Uh, that's over 350 years. That's about how many people were killed every 3 days under the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia, right, in the 1970s. So these sorts of comparisons, they really need, to be a lot more nuanced than they actually are. It just doesn't make sense to talk about religion as if we knew what that were, and the terrible violence that it's caused, and then not look at atheist regimes, for example. I mean, you look at the 20th century, look at the last 100 years, and ask who's killed more people, atheists or Muslims? And the answer is atheists, and it's not even close, right? Under Marxist regimes, estimates range between 70 and 110 million people killed. And so these are the kinds of things that I'm trying to overcome. So the basic argument is, look, people kill for all sorts of things, right? They kill for gods, but they kill for flags, they kill for the workers' revolution, they kill for free markets, they kill for money, etc. And so we need to take these things on a case-by-case basis and try to see what's gonna defuse the violence. The problem is violence. It's not religious violence or secular violence or whatever.
So, just as a clarification question, it seems like on one hand, you want to say that there is no such thing as a sort of well defined religion. Christopher Hitchens defines it as anything that causes violence, right?
Mm.
But it's kind of this amorphous thing that blends in with other things. But on the other hand, we want to say that religion causes not any more violence than, say, secular things at the same time, which kind of seems like we have a general idea of what it is. And so, in that sense, how in your work do you define religion in order to make these somewhat subtle distinctions?
Yeah, that's not my argument. I'm not saying that we know what what religious things are and secular things are, and we can compare them and add up the body counts. What I'm trying to show is how flexible these terms actually are, and we need to examine why some things are labeled religion and why some things are not, right? And this kind of relabeling of things goes on all the time, right? The Chinese government says the Dalai Lama is a political figure, and the West says no, he's a religious figure, right? What's kind of work is being done when these distinctions are made? Why do we insist that the kind of ritual pledging of allegiance, hand over heart to a flag, is not a religious thing? Whereas refusing to do so is a religious act, right? When the Jehovah's Witnesses do it. These are the kinds of questions that I think are the interesting questions to ask. But so I'm not trying to defend religion from this accusation as if I knew what religion was. So it's very clear to me that people kill for Islam. People kill for Christianity, things that are commonly labeled religion. But it's equally clear to me that they kill for nation states, especially. And that's something that kind of blows apart this whole myth of religious violence.
That's a really helpful distinction. In that case, then, should we just abandon the term religion if it's not really helpful in making these sort of distinctions?
Yeah, that's what I used to say. I had this interesting encounter with graduate students in political science at the University of California, Berkeley. And after I did my presentation, someone asked, well, what do we do with the term religion? And I said, I try to avoid it because it causes so much confusion. And they said, well, look, we've tried for years to get this very secular department to take religion seriously, and now you're pulling the wool out from under us. And so it became clear to me that you can't just avoid the term, but what we need to do is speak of the religious secular distinction not as a thing that exists out there in the world, but rather as a lens through which we view the world. And so there might be uses of this religious secular distinction that are relatively benign, right? If you want to use it to distinguish what I do in church from what I do in my garden, then fine. That's relatively harmless. Religious studies departments allow theology to go on at secular universities, and so okay, that might be a use. But in every circumstance, what I want to do is to examine what work this religious secular distinction is doing in any given context. And I'm in this book, The Myth of Religious Violence, I'm looking at one specific use of this religious secular distinction where it's not helpful. It, in fact, is often used to promote violence rather than to diffuse it. And I give lots of examples of that in the last chapter.
Well, that's some excellent clarifications around the term religion. Let's perhaps dive into the term secularism, because we were talking a bit earlier about sort of Marxist regimes who, in the name of atheism, led to a lot of death and destruction. And yet I can see someone in the secular camp going, those weren't truly secular because they were imposing their atheism and making that a worldview that was public and imposed upon everyone. But secularism is the absence of a worldview. It is refusing to impose your philosophy, your ideology, your worldview onto anyone and allowing the public space to be neutral. And so secularism tends to be put forward as the neutral option. And atheism is actually a positive option, or at least the imposing of a certain worldview. Is secularism really neutral? And is neutrality even possible?
Yeah, probably no and no, but I'm not ready to abandon the idea of looking for a modus vivendi so that we can all get along, right? So there's different things that get called secular and secularism and so on. So there's some things, so secular can be used to mean the absence of religion or the opposite of religion, in which case atheism would be secular. But it can also be used to talk about a certain kind of political regime in which there are no strong beliefs or life stances, whatever you want to call them, that get enshrined and that get favored by law. And so, and in that case, then I might be willing to agree with something like what Charles Taylor talks about when he talks about an open secularism, right? A closed secularism is one that tries to keep all, things that are defined as religion out of the public sphere. And so France or Quebec, where you ban the wearing of headscarves or the wearing of crucifixes in public offices because religion is considered to be this thing that needs to be kept out of public. And Taylor has argued for a kind of open secularism in which people are free to be who they are in public, and that is okay, right? A kind of closed secularism comes from a kind of liberalism that thinks that we can't have fundamental disagreements in public without killing one another, and I think that we can, right? That this is that the idea that we can't is part of this myth of religious violence that then is used to marginalize certain kinds of people, Muslims especially these days, and there's all kinds of, it's not just France, but there's all kinds of headscarf bans around Europe. So if what we're talking about is something like a kind of open secularism as Taylor uses it, then I think that's probably the best we can do at this point. But the idea that you can have a kind of neutral, a space that's neutral to all beliefs is just not true.
So, kind of following up on your question about on the question about whether or not religions cause violence, if we aren't 100% sure like how to sort of disentangle religion from other things, well, one of the apologetic tactics that I see in response to the myth of religious violence is to point out all the ways that religions have caused peace as well and have promoted peace and tranquility and communion among the nations. But that also seems like that it's a sword that cuts both ways. Can we then talk about ways that religions have caused peace? Or is that also something that, because of this category ambiguity, that we're not able to do?
Yeah, I would prefer not to talk about religion in these broad terms as if we know what we're talking about. I mean, what would it mean to say does politics cause peace or does politics cause violence? I mean, that would strike us as being a stupid question, right? And I think asking that about religion is just as stupid a question, right? What are you talking about? Where? How? And so the more specific you can get, the better. Does Christianity cause violence or peace? Does Islam cause violence or peace? That's getting closer to a reasonable argument. Still way too broad. I mean, there's 1.5 billion Christians, or probably 2 billion Christians and 1.5 billion Muslims. What would it mean to talk about Islam as such or Christianity as such, right? The more specific you can get, say, okay, this particular school of Wahhabism from 18th century Saudi Arabia, under conditions of Western colonialism, lends itself towards these sorts of uses, which can justify violence. That now you're getting into the vicinity of a reasonable sort of argument. But these arguments about religion are useless. Worse than useless. They're usually ideological.
You've done a fantastic job sort of deconstructing this attempt to one-up each other and say, you did this, well, we did that, and back and forth. And I'm just going to ignore that for a second and try to do it anyway. We usually think of colonialism as very much a Christian imposition upon the world. But what has been the role of secularism in neo-colonial violence?
Yeah. So, I mean, it is certainly the case that European colonialism was done by Christians. The relationship between the civil authority, between the state and the church, was oftentimes very fraught. And sometimes the church collaborated, and sometimes the church tried to defend the natives. So it's a messy history, but it's not one from which Christians can be exonerated. But what you see then after the period of Christianity kind of fades in the 20th century, you see that colonialism can go on under, without the church's support, right? So you look at the American intervention in the Middle East, for example, not in any way, for the most part, not justified by Christian kinds of justifications, right? Colin Dweck looks at the last 100 years and says America fights wars for liberal reasons or not at all, right? And so it's about free markets and free elections and those sorts of reasons that that colonialism it really takes hold in the Middle East and elsewhere, Latin America, for example, American colonialism. So that seems to me to be pretty obviously the case, where the myth of religious violence often adds to this colonial violence is when we look at, for example, Iran, right? 1979, the Islamic Revolution takes place there, and then we suddenly start taking notice of Iran, and we say, oh, look at that. They've had this kind of crazy religious fanaticism, this religious revival, and that has led to this terrible oppressive regime. And it is a terrible repressive regime, right? But we ignore then this, so this myth of religious violence then ignores the previous 26 years of Iranian history in which the United States and Britain, through a coup d'etat, overthrew a democratically elected president and installed a secularist dictator, the Shah, who then proceeded to torture and murder, tens of thousands of people and imposed a kind of secularist regime. People remember the Islamic dress code. They forget about the kind of secularist dress code under the previous Shahs. So that's the way it tends to work, is that we tend to concentrate on religious violence and ignore the kind of colonial violence to which the Islamic Revolution, for example, is a response.
I want to ask a sort of very pointed and specific question, if that's all right.
Sure.
So one of the responses that I've had is, okay, politics does cause violence, but we can't really live without politics. We have to have some sort of political order, or it's going to be really bad. And yes, people can abuse that. But in order to have something like witch hunts, you have to have a belief in some sort of supernatural. You have to have a certain set of beliefs that are inherently irrational, and they can motivate people to do some pretty terrible things. So this is why we should get rid of religion, because even if it's not specifically violent, it nevertheless is causing more violence than needs to be there anyway. Do you have any response to that?
Yeah, there's plenty of the equivalent of witch hunts in secular regimes as well, right? I just gave you the example of Pol Pot, who had an incredible bloodlust and did not require any sort of belief in God to make that happen. And that happens in all across all kinds of atheist regimes as well. But the idea, though, that we can live without religion again requires us to ask the question of, what do you mean by that? What would a world without any kind of strong beliefs look like? And so the book that I just published in January is called The Uses of Idolatry, and it's a sequel to The Myth of Religious Violence. And it basically argues that the holy doesn't just go away, it migrates to other places. People have a need to worship something, and people will do that, and it will just take on more and more kind of demonic forms if you try to repress the belief in the Christian God, for example. And so I'm not convinced that there is this sort of thing called religion which is expendable, and we can do without strong beliefs of any kind. And the examples that I look at in the book, one chapter on nationalism and another on consumerism, kind of showing how both of them act as replacements for Christianity in the modern era, and both of them can lead to violence as well.
Can you keep going a little bit on that? How has consumerism and what was the other one?
Nationalism.
And nationalism. Can you give some real concrete examples of like how these have become idols? And I think you even used the term demonic, correct?
I did, yeah. Provocatively, but yeah.
We like that on the podcast.
Good. Yeah, I noticed that you had an exorcist on here before, so yeah. I mean, so I do a whole chapter on nationalism. And there's a lot of scholars who call nationalism a religion and who argue that nationalism is basically the replacement for Christendom. It doesn't mean that Christianity necessarily disappears, but what people will kill and die for becomes the nation. and in the modern era, especially 19th century and onward. And so so I look at that scholarship and basically find it pretty persuasive. And these are not, for the most part, Christian scholars that are making these kinds of arguments, although some of them are. But it seems to me that that's really persuasive, and nationalism has caused a lot of violence. And I try to kind of do a sympathetic read of nationalism as well, because it is parasitic on certain real virtues of belonging and sacrifice for one's fellows and belief in something larger than oneself and so on. But precisely because it taps into these real virtues, it can become demonic. That's precisely the sense in which I meant demonic, is that it can be, it's very virulent and very strong, this idea that that killing for your country is not only necessary sometimes, but the ultimate sacrifice and the most praiseworthy thing that a person can do. And then when I talk about consumerism, it's a different sort of dynamic. But I look at the anthropology, which says that people naturally kind of create meaning by arranging physical objects around them. But something has changed in kind of late capitalism, where, for one thing, just the explosion of objects that we have and the immersion that we have in this kind of fantasy world of marketing, in which we're constantly encouraged to kind of think about acquiring new things. And looking at the reverse side of that, where we're looking at what's actually happening to workers in this kind of fantasy economy. And so objects take flight into transcendence and become part of the American dream, I think, is the language that really captures this kind of fantasy world. So objects are kind of taking flight into fantasy, while people are having the life kind of drained out of them. And so the people that are actually making the products in factories in China and so on, or working in the Amazon warehouse, are rendered invisible and oftentimes kind of exploited. And so this is yet another way in which a kind of perverse form of worship reacts back against us and oppresses us, right? That's the whole problem with gods. I actually begin the book with David Foster Wallace's famous quote. He's the novelist. He gave a famous commencement address at Kenyon College, and he said, one of the things he said was, in the day-to-day trenches of everyday life, there's no such thing as atheists. Everybody worships. And the only reason you might have for worshiping a god is that anything else you worship will eat you alive. Worship your looks and you'll always feel ugly. Worship money and you'll never have enough. Worship power and you'll always feel vulnerable, and so on. And that's what I'm trying to kind of do in the book, is make that argument that everybody worships, and the things that we worship end up kind of reacting back against us and eating us alive.
Is there some sort of correlation then between people's lack of religious affiliation or religious participation and adherence to capitalism or brand identity?
Yeah, I mean, Christians are certainly not immune to this, but I do worry that once people, Chesterton said something like, once people stop believing in God, they'll believe in anything. And I think that might be what we're seeing now, that the worship has to fall somewhere. And so even though Christians, if everybody worships badly, and that includes Christians. But once the object, once you're not even, once you don't have the disciplines of belonging to a church community and going to worship services and so on. I think there is a certain danger that this might not end up being a good thing for us.
Well, thank you so much for all of those thoughts. I think I'd love to in this sort of conclusion bring it back a few of the themes we developed earlier and apply them to a very immediate, relevant, contemporary question. With the Israel-Palestine conflict going on right now, how do you see these ideas of religious violence, secularism being used, assumed in the conversation on the news, in political analysis? What do you see being played out there?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen instances of the kind of myth of religious violence in this, right? Hamas are Muslims, and therefore they're, are prone to this sort of fanaticism. And then you can, and on the other side, they're kind of anti-Semitic tropes where, Jews are, hardwired towards this kind of violence because they believe in a violent God and so on, and are trying to clear out space in the in the promised land and so on. So you see those kind of tropes of the myth of religious violence. The purpose that it serves oftentimes is that then you can dismiss the grievances of the Palestinians, for example, by just chalking it up to a certain kind of, radical Islam. And what are you going to do? Those people over there have just been fighting for centuries. And, it's all about these kind of irrational beliefs, between Judaism and Islam. And what are you going to do? Right. So it gets used to kind of dismiss a really hard look at the history over the last 100 years of of the creation of Israel and the treatment of the Palestinians. When the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917, Jews were 6% of the population there, and so in order to make that into a majority Jewish state, a lot of people had to be displaced, and it could have been done otherwise, I think. And so. What we need to do in some ways, I think, is reimagine what it might look like to have a Jewish homeland in that area of the world, and also have justice for the people that had been living there, and see what mistakes were made and how it could have been done differently and how it can be done differently than it's currently being done with the occupation and the kind of apartheid conditions that the Palestinians live under. And so the myth of religious violence doesn't help to do this kind of sober analysis, I think.
Thank you so much for all you've given us so far. Now, for people whose curiosities might have been piqued, where can they find more about you and maybe some more on this topic?
Yeah, so my books are out there. Don't buy them from Amazon if you can avoid it, or any place owned by Amazon.
It's demonic.
What's that?
It's demonic.
Yeah, part of what I do in the new book is a critique of Amazon, and the whole kind of online shopping, how it disappears people and puts products in their place. But yeah, so the books are out there. There's a bunch of, I've done a bunch of podcasts. I've done a bunch of YouTube things that you can easily find me. You can find playlists of my stuff on YouTube. So yeah, it's all readily available. I have not been shy.
Thanks again for listening to the Spiritually Incorrect podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to like and subscribe below, or to check us out on Spotify. And if you want to hear more from this week's episode or guest, our Patreon account has exclusive unaired content, often featuring up to an hour of additional footage and interviews for each episode. We save some of the most controversial and pulse-pounding topics just for our Patreon members. Members get access to that, plus the chance to meet monthly with Jonathan and I, suggest episode topics, join us live for an episode to ask the special guests questions, or even get a personalized episode custom-made just for you. Check out our Patreon link in the description below. And don't forget to check out our official website at spirituallyincorrectpodcast.com to see what else you're missing out on. Sound effects from Zapsplat.com. Special thanks to Jordan Birch, whose song Starry Night provides the intro and outro for this podcast. You can hear more of his music on YouTube or Spotify.